Welcome into another episode of Texas Sports Unfiltered. We're talking college football today, and we're joined by one of the best, a national college football insider for CBS Sports, Shehan Jeyarajah. Nice enough to join me today on TSU. Shehan, thanks so much for the time, man. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. Thank you for being here. And college football season is upon us, and it's a beautiful thing. We'll start with the Longhorns. This is a Longhorn-centric channel, and then we'll go around the Big 12 and around the state, maybe around the country too. But you live in the state of Texas. You've covered Texas for a number of years. Look, Texas fans are confident every single season, right? But it sure feels like things feel a little different for the Longhorns in 2023. Your thoughts on this Texas team and some of the expectations surrounding this program this year?
Yeah, well, I know that the sort of popular thing to say is, oh my gosh, Texas overrated every year, overhyped by the media. But if you look back at the history of this conference, Texas hasn't been picked to win the conference since 2009. And I'll tell you what, I've covered this conference since 2013. I've never once picked Texas to win the conference. And that changed this year. Texas, I think, deserves to be the preseason favorite. I think that this is a year where when you look at not just Texas, but the state of the Big 12 right now, I think this is a year that Texas not only should win the conference, but in some ways has to at least make the Big 12 title game. You know, the case that I've made is that I think when you look around Texas roster, you can make the case that they have three of the top five best players in the Big 12. And I'm talking about tight end Ja'Tavion Sanders, left tackle Kelvin Banks, and linebacker Jalen Ford. And that's not even getting into Quinn Ewers. That's not even getting into Xavier Worthy. That's not getting into other talented receivers or defensive linemen or Jalen Catalon, anybody like that. So I think that when you look at the top end talent mixed with the experience that Texas brings back, there's really no excuses to me for Texas not to be at number one at the end of the year. The other part of this, too, is that when you look around at the other main contenders in the Big 12, most of them are in some level of rebuilding. Kansas State just lost two of their best players in Deuce Vaughn and Felix Anudike-Uzomah. TCU just lost four All-America caliber players on offense. Oklahoma, they're still replacing 30 to 35 guys off a team that went 6-7 last year. And so you look at the other top contenders in the Big 12, I think that they have much bigger holes than what Texas has coming into the year. So really, when I look at Texas in 2023, this is just a Steve Sarkisian question. He's coached for 9 years as a head coach, never won more than 8 regular season games in any season in his career. This has to be the year that changes, or we have to have some tough conversations about whether he's the guy who can get them to the top.
Absolutely. Yeah, Shehan, you brought up a couple of the other Big 12 teams, right? TCU and Oklahoma, just to name a few. Who do you think is the biggest threat to the Longhorns in the Big 12 this year? Because I'm with you. It does feel like this conference is wide open, and it does feel like most teams have more questions than answers right now. But outside of Texas, if it's not going to be Texas, who do you think is the team that's going to get it done in this league this year?
Well, I think it is important for me to know. I picked Texas first in the conference. I think that West Virginia, for me, is probably a consensus last place pick. Maybe Cincinnati gets in there. But almost anybody else, I think, could finish in any other spot. I mean, I think that when we look at teams participating in the Big 12 title game, it would not surprise me at all if we're talking about a 6-3 Big 12 team potentially making their way to Arlington, just with the way the schedule works out. So certainly, I think that Kansas State deserves to be under consideration. They did lose, like I mentioned, Deuce Vaughn and Felix Anudike-Uzomah, but they bring back quarterback Will Howard, who was actually my pick for preseason All Big 12 first-team quarterback. They bring back their entire offensive line, a really, really good running back room, aided by Trayshawn Ward transferring in from Florida State. And defensively, they again, have to replace a couple of key pieces, but depth-wise, they're in a really good spot. So I think Kansas State will be right there at the end once again. And also, Chris Klieman, I would make the case, is probably the most proven coach in the Big 12 right now. Depending on how we're feeling about Mike Gundy right about now.
Right.
But I think that they're going to be right there in the conversation. Texas Tech is certainly a team that can push their way in. Again, I see their ceiling as probably like a 9-3 team, but that might be good enough in order to get to Arlington, just depending on how some things work out. Obviously replacing Tyree Wilson at defensive end, but they didn't have Tyree Wilson for their last 3 games and managed to still win their last 3 games, including, of course, last year they beat Texas and Oklahoma for the first time in program history. So offensively, they do bring back a lot. They started 3 different quarterbacks last year because of injuries. If they're able to settle on Tyler Shuck and keep him healthy and upright, I think that they have the opportunity to do some big things. So those would be the 2 most obvious ones. Certainly you have to mention Oklahoma. I mean, 6-7 last year, but they have probably the easiest schedule in the entire Big 12 this year. And they, I think, made some really big additions on the defensive side of the ball to try to cover up a couple of their holes, especially in run defense. I don't know necessarily that they have that top end ability, even with the state of their talented roster, but certainly you have to mention them as well as somebody who could at least have an opportunity to get to Arlington.
Absolutely. All right. You mentioned Cincinnati earlier. It doesn't sound like you're too high on the Bearcats this year, but the 4 new teams coming into the Big 12 this season with Houston, with Cincinnati, with BYU, and with UCF. Do you think any of those teams make any noise this year? Or do you think it maybe takes a couple of years for them to kind of get their sea legs under them?
Well, when you look at teams moving to the Power 5 and specifically to the Big 12, I look back at TCU, I look back at West Virginia when they came up in 2012. In their first 2 seasons, both of them went to combined 14-11. And so it's pretty difficult. Both of those teams were coming off of New Year's Six bowls whenever they did make that change. And so it's a tough transition just from a depth perspective to step into the Big 12 and be ready right away. So when I look at the team that probably has the most depth and is most prepared from a roster perspective, it has to be UCF. I mean, when you look at metrics like the 247 talent composite, UCF is up there with the top of the Big 12 right now outside of Texas and Oklahoma. They're, I believe, right behind TCU and Oklahoma State. So, they are a roster that I think is already a Power 5 quality roster. And they also are the only team that brings back a quarterback in John Reese Plumlee out of these new 4. So I think that's going to give them an opportunity to potentially have a nice year. I don't know if they can get to contention range, but I do think that they're going to be an easy bowl team and probably more than that. When I look at the rest of the group, it's really about who can stay healthy, because BYU, I like their top 22. Once you get to 23 to 30, I'm not feeling so good about them anymore. Cincinnati defensively has a chance to be pretty special. They're going to be a top 25 to 30 unit led by Dante Corleone on the defensive line, but offensively, they could be a mess. Emory Jones comes over as quarterback after getting benched at Arizona State and Florida. And I don't necessarily know that they're going to be dynamic in any way on the offensive side of the ball. So huge question for them. And then, Houston's really interesting because they have the opposite problem. They've got tons of dynamic players, and I don't know what they have depth-wise and line-wise. And so, I think that any of them have the chance to jump up. Definitely, I think all have the ability to overperform if some things break right for them. But for me, I think that those other 3 teams are probably going to be settling right around bowl range. And again, when you look at the Big 12 this year, obviously, I think Texas is the only team that even has the possibility of making the college football playoff if things go right. I don't see another team that can make it through at 11-1. But the other part of this is that when you look at the Big 12 this upcoming year, every single team, all 14 of them, are ranked in the top half of the SP Plus rankings. The Big 12 is the only conference where every single team is rated top half. So it's going to be a really competitive year. And if you're not top of the top, it could be really difficult.
Yeah, and you don't have Kansas to beat up on anymore, right?
No.
It feels like they've kind of figured some things out, which makes this conference that much tougher. Stepping away from the Big 12, Shehan, and staying in the state of Texas, what about Texas A&M, man? Obviously coming off of an incredibly disappointing 5-7 season. Jimbo had the ridiculous buyout, so there were no really legitimate talks of moving on, but it's clear that the pressure is on and the seat is starting to warm up in Aggieland. Your expectations for A&M here in 2023?
Yeah, and actually, if they fired Jimbo Fisher after this year, they would owe him still more than the $75 million contract that they initially handed out. So it's pretty crazy what they got going on over there. Look, I like the fact that Jimbo Fisher took a step back and brought in an offensive coordinator in Bobby Petrino. I don't know if Bobby Petrino is the perfect fit, the exact right guy there. And frankly, they're going to have to figure out sort of the personalities on that coaching staff, because it's kind of a strange group with Jimbo Fisher, with Steve Adazio as offensive line coach, with Bobby Petrino as, of course, offensive coordinator, DJ Durkin on the defensive side of the ball. And by the way, one other thing to mention is that their defensive line coach, Terry Price, who was a real mainstay in that organization, unfortunately passed away after a battle with an illness. And so they're going to have to figure out some of the staff chemistry stuff, I think, as much as anything else. But, obviously from a talent perspective, I don't need to tell people about how talented Texas A&M is. They were number 4 in the 247 talent composite last year. I think that having a quarterback with a little experience helps. Connor Wegman coming in, he's a very talented player. Everybody in the country wanted him. And ultimately he decided to go to Texas A&M. I think he's going to show improvement, but he certainly was not ready whenever he was thrust into starting action last year. Offensive line wise, this was one of the worst units that they had put out in a couple of years and was a huge part of their issues. And on defense, I think that the defensive issues kind of got overlooked because of how bad the offense was last year. They fell from, I believe, top 15 in total defense to the mid 50s after losing Mike Elko and replacing him with DJ Durkin. So still a lot of questions for me in terms of them being able to legitimately compete for the SEC West. I don't think they're going to be as bad as 5-7 by any means, but I also don't necessarily know that they have much more than 7-5 or 8-4 in them, especially with the schedule that actually gets harder. They replace Florida at home with a road game at Tennessee this year. They play Miami on the road instead of at home this year. So it's not going to be an easy path. And so, I think that for me, if I see major progress, if I see Connor Wegman sort of step up and become the guy by the end of the year, that's what I'm looking for more than them competing right away this year.
What about Alabama, Shehan? It's weird to not see Alabama ranked as the preseason number 1 team in the country, and it's even weirder to have to look all the way down the paper to find them at number 4. Their lowest preseason ranking since 2009. Now, me as a Texas fan, I unfortunately remember how that season ended for them. But no Bryce Young, no Jahmyr Gibbs, no Will Anderson. I get that Bama loses awesome players every year and they just replace them with more 5-stars. But does this Bama team feel worse? Is this a more vulnerable group than maybe Nick Saban has ever had in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, it's a weird group, like you mentioned, because they had arguably the top offensive and defensive player in college football last season in Bryce Young and Will Anderson, and they lost 2 games. And I don't need to tell Tex fans, they probably should have lost at least 1 or 2 more. And so it's a strange year. It's a strange group. In some ways, they're starting over this year. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that what they did the last 2 years, and they played in a national title game 2 years ago, but yeah. I don't think that what they did the last 2 years is something that's sustainable for this program. They needed Bryce Young to consistently bail them out of close games, and without him in the lineup, I wonder what the record would have been last year, right? They might have been a 4-loss team or something like that if he wasn't playing. So I do think they're going to start over. I think that there are positives to that. There are obviously negatives to that. They bring in Kevin Steele, at defensive coordinator, to kind of get back to business a little bit. One thing that really stood out to me about Pete Golding, their former defensive coordinator, is I think he was just much more of I feel like you can tell how defensive coordinators see the game, right? Some see it through a defensive line lens. I think that Kirby Smart is kind of like that. It starts up front and kind of builds back. I think that Pete Golding kind of starts from the back and builds front. And there are some really good defensive coordinators who build that way. I think that in some ways, Pete Kwiatkowski is kind of like that. And he builds great defenses. But I think that when you're Alabama, you got the bulk. You've got the ability to start up front in a way that other teams don't. And I think that going to Kevin Steele kind of brings it back to a front-centered group as opposed to maybe more of a back-centered group. And I think that Pete Golding's actually going to be pretty successful at Ole Miss now. I think that fits a little better. So it's going to be an interesting transition for them. I expect that we could get back to a little bit more bully ball from them. But, look, they are – I've made the bold prediction for our series over at CBSSports.com. I don't think that any SEC West team is going to be competing for the playoff by the end of the year. I think that every single team in the West will have at least 2 losses, including Alabama, including LSU. And so it's, I think, going to be a strange year. They're going to have to work through some growing pains. I mean, obviously Texas plays that game on the road in week 2. I mean, this is such a huge opportunity, I think, for this program, because I do think Alabama will still be figuring some stuff out. And so I do think that by the end of the year, they will have those things figured out. I expect them to destroy whatever bowl opponent they get in probably a New Year's Six bowl. But I do think that it's going to be a little bit of a slog in some ways, and maybe it takes some time, and maybe they don't win the West again.
I noticed you said SEC West. You did not say SEC. Look, growing up for me, and I think you and I are around the same age, Shehan, it was like when Tiger Woods was in the prime of his career, it was always Tiger versus the field. Is that what college football now is? Is it Georgia versus the field? I mean, they're the preseason number 1. They're the favorites to win it all again. I know three-peats aren't easy, but hell, repeats aren't easy, and they made it look easy last year. Is this a Georgia versus the field thing, or are there other teams on their level this season?
Well, I do think that we do need to look at it as Georgia versus the field for a couple of reasons. One, obviously they've won the last 2, but I think the other part of it is that you look at the other top contenders, and there's some pretty major questions about them. I mean, Alabama, of course, there are 3 teams that recruit just differently than everybody else in college football. That's Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State. All 3 of them are replacing quarterbacks this year, which I think will make things pretty interesting. I look at the other top teams, right? Michigan starts number 2. Michigan, the last 2 years, right? They play Georgia, get wiped off the field. They play TCU, they lose in the college football playoff. Now they obviously have the situation with Jim Harbaugh getting suspended for a couple of games. I mean, I don't think they're a flawless team. And the point that I made heading into last year's playoff is that they're not one of the recruiting superpowers. They are a blue chip ratio team, but they rank around 12 to 13 in talent, not 3 to 4, like a lot of other teams that compete for titles. So, I mean, again, when you look around, I think that this could potentially be a year where Georgia's maybe standing alone in some ways. But I do think there are teams that will be able to compete. I mean, Ohio State will have some time to get it together. Alabama, if they can make it through the West, if they can be a 1-loss team, they're going to have a shot against Georgia in the SEC title game. I don't think it's inevitable by any means. I mean, we saw that 2 years ago whenever Alabama went through and beat Georgia in the title game. So I do think that this is a Georgia versus the field year, but I think the field has some teams that have the ability to step up. I mean, not even getting into a team like Florida State, or not even getting into a team like USC that potentially has some upside if their defense can integrate some new pieces. So it's an interesting year. I think in some ways, if this were one of the most wide open years that we ever see for actually competing for the title, I don't think it would shock me, but the conventional logic, I think, absolutely needs to be Georgia versus the field until it's proven otherwise.
A couple more for you, Shehan, and really do appreciate you joining me today. What about some sleepers? We've talked about some of the big brands, some of the biggest dogs in college football, but maybe some teams that could crash the college football playoff party this year.
So the Pac-12 is going to be, I think, the most interesting conference in football this year. And obviously, I think that there are, 3 or 4 or 5 teams that people understand can compete for the Pac-12. But I think that Oregon State legitimately has the upside in their final year as a power conference team to win 11 games, go to a Pac-12 championship, and have a shot to maybe be that 4 seed in the college football playoff.
Wow.
So they were maybe the quietest 10-win team in the country last year. They closed out the year by winning 30-3 over Florida in their bowl game, a team that Utah, which had a shot near the end of the year, lost to in their first week. And so I think that the upside is potentially there if they can maintain on defense after a couple of losses. They have arguably the best tackle combo in the entire country, a great running back in Damian Martinez, who's actually from DFW. And they add DJ Uiagalelei to the mix. And look, he does not need to come in and save everything. He just needs to come in and be better than what they had last year. And what people don't realize is Oregon State's quarterback threw for only 60 yards in the win over Oregon last year. So if they're able to get a little more than what they got from that position last year, I think that could be huge. And I think Jonathan Smith is really good at making the game easy for quarterbacks. He coached at Washington under Chris Peterson before, was offensive coordinator, and they use a lot of pre-snap motion, a lot of pre-snap reads. just again, when you looked at Clemson, it was a lot of, stand up, step out there and make a lot of reads, and you kind of have to stand for yourself. I think the game's just going to be easier for DJ as he goes to Oregon State. So I really like them as a team that could potentially make some noise. Again, maybe at the lower end of playoff, I've really been high on NC State this offseason. They bring in Brennan Armstrong at quarterback, who led the country in passing in 2021, and he reunites with this old offensive coordinator, Robert Anae, over at NC State. They were great defensively last year. They bring back a decent amount of production. And I think that maybe you add a quarterback with to the group that really has the ability to do some dynamic things, along with a defense that's had a lot of success. I mean, if they were to crash the Florida State Clemson party in the ACC, I don't think it would be a huge shock to me.
I like that. Oregon State and NC State has some sleepers this year. I'm going to put some wagers on the over. Thank you very much for that, Shehan. Obligatory realignment question. I don't even know where to take this thing because, look, we're recording this video, transparency, on a Friday, probably posted a couple of days later. Something else could happen between now and then. We'll go with this one, Shehan. I mean, the biggest surprise for you in realignment to this point, and maybe something that you could expect to happen at some point in the not too distant future.
I think that it was a surprise just how dire the situation was in the Pac-12. We heard all year that, well, the offer's probably not going to be very good. Everybody's at risk of leaving. But my thought was always, well, look, I think that they don't want to leave. And I still believe that Pac-12 schools did not want to have to leave. It was when the number was low, which is one thing, but two, when you talk about the loss of exposure by being a subscription product on Apple TV Plus, that's just unpalatable for a major college football conference. I mean, so much of the Pac-12's issues over the last decade have been the fact that a lot of their key games and key products have been on a network that most of the country can't watch. I mean, the Heisman Trophy winner is playing and opening his season this weekend, and most of the country can't even watch it because it's on the Pac-12 network. And so I think that for the Pac-12, that was completely unpalatable. That was not realistic, but I can't believe that the Pac-12 office and George Kliavkoff didn't understand that dynamic a little better. That's a shock to me in a lot of ways. And once that became the case, I mean, look, I kind of thought that maybe a thread might unravel if that were the case. Obviously, Colorado kind of jumped early and kind of saw the writing on the wall and in some ways kicked this off. I am also a little surprised that the Big Ten was so, I guess, open to taking Oregon and Washington. But I guess when you get them at a half share, I guess that's an opportunity that you have to take. But that was just a shock to me how fast it happened. And again, it was basically, we talked about worst case scenarios, and it just happened within the course of like 48 hours. I mean, funnily enough, this was 3 weeks ago from the time that we're recording. I mean, I was in Houston at my brother's graduation on that day, and they're like, hey, so everything's happening right now. Everything's happening today. It's just, nobody expected just a random Friday in August that the entire Pac-12 would collapse. So it was a shock to me how quickly that happened. When I talk about heading forward, I do think, first of all, that Oregon State and Washington State will ultimately join the Mountain West. I do think that, maybe it's more of a merger. Maybe they keep some of the branding. I mean, the thing with the Pac-12 is that they have some legal status as an autonomy conference. The branding of the Pac-12 obviously is still pretty powerful because of its legacy. So maybe there's some sort of merger that ultimately ends up keeping some sort of similar name. But I do think that it ends up being with these West Coast teams, because if you're going to be joining what we've known as a Group of Five conference, I think that you want to stay geographic. I don't think that you want to be, having to go down to SMU or to South Florida or things like that when you're obviously not going to be making a ton of money to do it. I think that ultimately too, it sounds like things are moving in a Stanford and Cal joining the ACC direction, which is pretty crazy to me.
Yeah.
But, it sounds like they might use that as an opportunity to give Stanford and Cal smaller payouts and give some of that money to other schools who are obviously unhappy about the amount that they're receiving. So it's a lot right now. I mean, if we want a crazy long-term prediction, I think that this model is not going to work as well as people think it will. I don't think that look, you look at Texas and joining the SEC, that makes sense. It's a regional brand. You're actually reuniting in some ways with Texas A&M, with Arkansas, schools that Texas cared about for a long time. This Big Ten thing is a mess. And I don't think it's going to end up actually being a positive situation for that conference long term. I mean, ultimately, I think that it just shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics of college football, because the reason that people care about college football is because, when I'm growing up in Dallas, I know Texas and Texas A&M and Baylor and TCU and Texas Tech fans, and like, we can have conversations. Our teams play each other, and it's not just that we're playing a team that's close. It's that I know people. I can have fun with it in a different kind of way. I think that when Ohio State is going to play at Washington, that's not the same thing. There's no tie between these schools. There's no reason that these schools will care about each other in some way. So I wouldn't be shocked if in 15 to 20 years that some of these teams, especially in the SEC and Big Ten, look around and kind of say, the checks are nice, but we've kind of fundamentally lost the plot of what we're doing, and we want to reunite with some of these schools that made sense before. So that's my crazy long-term prediction. But I do think that it might not come until I'm old and gray that maybe we have these sort of things happen. But I do believe that I think that there's this push to make college football into a mini NFL in some ways. Yep. And my case with that is, why would people want to watch minor league football over the NFL? The thing about college football is that there have been draws to it that have nothing to do with the NFL, or are in no way competing with the NFL, that I think are central to the appeal of the sport. So it'll be a dynamic to watch for sure. And I think that, maybe in 2036, when the ACC contract ends, we're maybe talking about having to really sit down and think about what really works in college football.
Incredibly well said. Incredibly well said. And yeah, it does feel like college football is losing college football these days, which is a huge shame. And yeah, it makes all of us wonder kind of what the future holds for this sport that we all hold so near and dear to our hearts. Last thing, I hope I'm not spoiling anything. I don't know if you've released your predictions on CBSSports.com just yet, but Shehan, would love to get your CFP predictions and then your national championship winner here for 2023.
Yeah, I believe it'll be coming out in the next week, but it's okay. I think I'm going to spoil it on another show, so it's fine. So I think that Georgia is my number 1 seed. Their path is so easy. I honestly think that they could lose the SEC title game and it wouldn't impact their spot in the playoff. So I think that they're my 1 seed. Number 2 is interesting because you basically have to pick the winner of the Ohio State-Michigan game.
Yep.
And this year I'm going to go with Ohio State. I think that they're ready by that point. I can't see 3 in a row, but I also couldn't see 2 in a row. So I'm probably not giving enough respect to what Michigan brings to the table, but I'm going to go with Ohio State as my 2 seed. Number 3, I think that 3 and 4 gets really interesting. Obviously, I feel like if Ohio State loses the Ohio State-Michigan game, they can get in because they play Notre Dame. They play a better non-conference schedule. Michigan plays nobody. Michigan basically only plays Ohio State and Penn State. So if they lose that game, I don't think they have the schedule to be able to get in at 11-1. So I think Michigan's out. So with my 3 seed, I'm going to go with USC. I feel like we all watched the Cotton Bowl and saw how that ended. And I feel like because of that game and because of some of the embarrassments at the end of the year, we've ignored the fact that USC was literally a Caleb Williams injury away from going to the college football playoff last year in Lincoln Riley's first season. And now they add Bear Alexander to the mix. Now they add Anthony Lucas, another 5-star former defensive lineman to the mix. A couple of really good players at linebacker. They've got a great freshman Tackett Curtis, who I think has a chance to be pretty special. And then offensively, they should still be the best team in the country, arguably. So I think that they're going to be, I think they're going to emerge from the Pac-12, and it's going to be pretty difficult. This is a really good Pac-12, but I think that they'll emerge at 12-1 and conference champions. And with my 4th pick, I'm going to go with Florida State. I think that LSU is obviously going to Florida to play them in week 1. I think if they win that game, which I think they have a good chance of doing, they're going to be top 5 from basically that moment onwards. And they play Clemson in week 4, I believe it is, on the road. But they can lose that game if they get Clemson back in the conference championship game. So I think that they're going to give themselves a chance at the end of the year. They return a ton of production from a team that won 10 games last year, including sixth-year quarterback Jordan Travis, including likely first-round pick Jared Verse at defensive end. So they have a chance to be pretty special, I think. I think that they're my number 4 team, but I'll tell you what, if none of these teams are in it at the end of the year, that wouldn't be a huge shock to me. I think this is one of the most open college football playoff races we've had in several years.
I love it. If Georgia's not in there, I think it'd be a big shock to you. Everybody else, maybe not. But that's awesome. Shehan, you're the man. Y'all make sure to follow Shehan on Twitter. You see his handle at the top right portion of your screen, and check out the great work he does at cbssports.com. Shehan, really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.